Good morning, dear friends out there in Zoom land, the dear St.Michael's community. It's such a pleasure to riff with you on the resurrection in this end of the Easter season. In a podcast I did with your highly evolved rector, Johnny Newton, I explored some of the more abstract or theological elements of resurrection. But today, I want to just tell you a story, because the question at this point for me is, what does resurrection look like? And will we know it when we see it? What is it? Well, I dropped out of college in 1977 because I knew enough to know that I wasn't going anywhere fast. I had enough sense to know that I had to interrupt the way of life I was sort of living in a sleepwalking sort of way. But I didn't have any idea of where I was going or where I was supposed to go. So I spent half a year just wandering through Europe on $8 a day. And by the time I arrived in London, several months into my journey, I was a seasoned gypsy, living on nothing but bread, cheese, Hemingway, and Camus. I tried to hitchhike to Scotland. After spending a couple of nights under an overpass near the Cotswolds of England, I was finally picked up by a trucker who was headed toward Wales, not Scotland. So I changed my plan and took the ride, glad for some movement. And after several more rides, I ended up in Ambleside. It's a little town in the Lake District of Northwest England. By the time I arrived in Ambleside, which is in the it's in the Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge country. By the time I arrived there, I was tired and cynical and lonely. Months of existentialist introspection had made me feel disconnected. I didn't know where to sleep because the youth hostel had been closed for some reason, and I couldn't afford a bed and breakfast, and I was worn out from camping. As I wandered down the main street of Ambleside looking for a place to stay, I saw a sign that said, Mrs. Thompson's Lodging, now open. I found myself knocking on the door, utterly exhausted by my 40-pound backpack that contained all of my earthly belongings. A red-cheeked, middle-aged woman opened the door. She smiled and simply said, "Welcome." I looked at her and almost cried, suddenly missing my mother. I was a 20-year-old boy on the proverbial quest to find himself in the modern world. And Mrs. Thompson turned out to be the risen Christ in disguise, who greeted me from out of nowhere in the town of Ambleside. After mumbling that I could spend no more than $2 per night, I walked in at her urging, feeling both amazed and terrified. I somehow knew that things would never be the same again. She took me upstairs, showed me my bedroom, and which was the room that her only son grew up in. And I soon learned that her husband had died only 3 months earlier, and that I was the very first boarder in her new bed and breakfast business. I spent 8 days with Mrs. Thompson as her only guest. And in that short period of time, both she and I received healing for our wounds, and we both came alive in new and unexpected ways. The first day, I woke up to a full English breakfast of eggs and bacon, toast and marmalade, stuffed tomatoes, and porridge. Then Mrs. Thompson packed me a lunch and showed me the hiking trails of Beatrix Potter and Coleridge. And she also gave me a book of poems by William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet who had lived across the valley near Lake Windermere. I didn't know it at the time, but these hikes from 9 to 4 p.m. each day would awaken something in me that had been asleep for so long. Those healing hikes awakened a long dormant love of God, which was aroused by the beauty of this world. I arrived back at Mrs. Thompson's each day at 4 for tea, scones, and jam. We would watch together the Wimbledon tennis tournament, and we rooted for Bjorn Borg and Virginia Wade. While watching, we talked freely and easily about everything. I trusted her and she trusted me. We talked about her husband who had died, about living in England during World War II, and about literature. We mostly talked about God, though God's name was never mentioned, and I didn't really know it at the time. But in the early evening of my first full day, Mrs. Thompson suggested that since I was in England, I might read Shakespeare instead of Hemingway. After telling her that I had never read Shakespeare and that he seemed archaic and hard to read, she gave me a copy of Macbeth and gave me some background to better understand it. In her son's old bedroom, I read Macbeth for the first time in one sitting that night. My imagination was so stirred by this other world that for 2 full hours, I forgot completely about myself. I remember thinking how Macbeth's ambition to have power, position, and wealth overruled his desire to be good, and that in the end, he was driven to violence to achieve his goals, and he ended up with nothing. After reading this play, I found myself engaging in a sort of prayer or a dialogue that took the form of a lively interaction with an interior companion. I was no longer a loner. The risen Christ had become my partner, a live companion who invited me to co-think, plan, and strategize with him about everything. I was waking up and found myself caring about the world and those who lived in it. Over the course of the 8 days that I lived with Mrs. Thompson, my muted world became a lively dialogue from within and without. This was the beginning of a real shift from a me way of thinking to a we way of thinking, planning, and acting. This lady who opened her home and heart to me had become a real friend who helped me see into a whole other world. She engaged me as a partner, not as a soloist. On my return to Texas weeks later, I re-enrolled in the University of Texas as an English major. And not long after that, I found myself entering the Episcopal Seminary. I kept up with Mrs. Thompson by letter for several years until her death over 20 years ago. My direct encounter with Mrs. Thompson was what sparked my interest and fueled my excitement. Forgetting about myself, I became eager to be part of God's life, for God had become part of my life, meeting me directly through one of his resurrection partners. Now, in our world, which right now seems to be conditioned by fear and violence, Jesus came alive from out of the dead ones to call his beloved friends into life. And how do we know Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, because he's alive and happening in, with, and through, and for people like you and me all over the world. And so when we open the eyes of our heart through the eyes of faith, we will see the signs and the evidence of resurrection, of the post-resurrection Jesus who comes alongside us, who becomes our interior companion. When this gets through, we know it. It's not something we prove. It's something we see, hear, and receive. It is then the gift of the Lord's abiding presence. And this is the precise moment when our soloist adventures end and the adventure of going with the beloved to Galilee as partners with the risen Christ begins. Okay, that's all I've got. That's my story. I hope Mrs. Thompson will inspire you, will help you see the Mrs. Thompsons in your own lives. And God bless St. Michael's. I love you guys, your rector. I attended All Saints when it was on the BK Road years ago when I was in seminary in the early 80s. And I've been watching y'all grow and ripen. And now that you've got Mr. John Newton, I'm confident in your community and your capacity to be the risen Christ in your own time and space. Thanks. God bless. Amen.